Man, I can tell you how many times I've recorded this intro because each and every time I've done it, I've pretty much laughed at myself. In any event, welcome back to the zone. In today's video, we're going to walk through the player creation process that I'm using for this fictional basketball league. Now, as of today, there are 23 teams that have been completed with 7 to go, and our focus is going to be on the last player for the Toronto Raptors. Now, as a reminder, this is being created for 2K21 on current gen, on the Xbox specifically, and a lot of the screens that you'll see will be different from a lot of the content that is being created today. So let's get into it. All right, so we're going to get started here. But before we dive in, I want to talk about the creative process that is being used for this league. And I want to give kudos to Unique Mazik because this is his brainchild, and I just added certain things to it to make my league kind of unique. And so what you see on the screen is what I'm calling the player card. And so with the player cards, this is going to serve as the basis for the player creation that is being used for all of the players in this league. I even used this for my first draft class. Now, I didn't use it for every player, but I identified the players that had a weird look to them, and I used this on them. So a key example would be Harry Reynolds. Another one would be Vitaly Belus, as players that are in my draft class that you'll see along in this series. Now, as part of that, what Unique Mazik did is that first he would use a randomizer to identify which player DNA would serve as the basis for the player creation. And so that means that every player within the Umba League, as he called it, had a player DNA from an existing player on the 2K roster, like a current, I shouldn't say existing, but a current player on the 2K roster, or a player that might be a legend or somebody from one of the all-time teams, as an example, right? And then from there, he would then assign a position so that off the rip, it's not going to be a one-to-one match between the DNA that's being imported into the player that's being created. What's different between his approach and my approach is that I changed the age of the player that's being brought in as well as the number of years pro. Whereas Unique Mazik kept that standard so that folks could progress along their career. I made that change just to add some variability between the two of our approaches. Now on the player card, you'll see that I crossed out 0, and we've assigned the number of years pro to this specific player, and that's mainly because I'm using the draft class that I used in season 1 of my league. And so as a result, that's 150 players that have 0 years of professional experience. Now, I didn't want this league to have more than that. I didn't want everybody in the league to be a rookie because that would kind of skew all the stats, etc. for the year. Another thing that I did differently between Unique Mazik's approach and mine is that not all players are going to be based off of a player DNA. Some, in fact, are going to be based off of a 2K base. So, for example, Omar Abdul Rauf, he is based off a 2K base, and he turned out pretty decent. And the reason I took this approach is based off of that first draft class that I brought into my league. Mainly because there were some players that are really good, and I'm not even talking about the players that in fact have a player DNA imported into them, like Harry Reynolds. I'm talking about just regular old 2K bases that seem to perform fairly well in the league, whether it be simulation wise or going head to head in a competition. So as a result, my randomizer picks and chooses whether or not it's going to be a player DNA or a 2K base based off of a formula. And then from there, we take the same creative process whereby changing the age, change the position, change the number of years pro. Now let's move to the body. So you'll see on the player card that I crossed out the height and the weight. Now, following Unique Mazik's approach, I did the same thing in that the position that is being selected by the randomizer would dictate the height and weight associated with the player. Now, in my case, I noticed that there were a lot of players that were getting flagged for 7 foot and above. And looking at the roster at that point in time, I think it was January of 2021, maybe a little bit later, there were only 37 players that were above 7 foot. So I eventually capped that same amount for this league. So that includes the players that are from the fictional draft class, as well as the additionals players that I've created thus far. So as a result, I then had to re-randomize the height and weight for the players based off of the position that's being identified, which is why you see that we have this player being 6'11" with a weight of 255 pounds. So now that we know that this player is going to be 6'11", 255 pounds, the very first thing that I do is I open up the Create a Player menu and I scroll down to Import the Player DNA. And then I select Use NBA Player. And then from here, just navigate to the team in question. So we're going to the all-time Pistons. And then look for Isaiah Thomas. And then what I like to do in this case is I like to jot down the details for the player DNA that is being brought in, so I can understand what changes are being made in more detail. So in this case, the great Isaiah Thomas is a point guard, shooting guard, and based on the player card, we're now changing his position to a power forward, small forward. So I also jot down the height, the weight, the age, as well as the number of badges, so I can make that comparison as well. So when you click on the player, you're going to see three options: import the appearance and the attributes. So that's essentially saying bring in all of the details associated with this player, because we're essentially creating a doppelganger, right? The second option is going to be you just want to be able to bring in the appearance, but you want to keep the attributes of the 2K base that is already there. So if you're looking to perform experiments based off of different types of builds to see what the 2K League would look like if Isaiah Thomas was not Isaiah Thomas, from a skills perspective, this is what you would do here. And then the final option is import the attributes and keep the appearance, which is what we want to do here, because we want to keep the appearance of the player that we have already. We just want to be able to bring in the attributes. So I'll click onto that, and now we have everything saved. So with that saved, the very first thing I do is I go to the vitals, and then I just randomize the name so it's different. Granted, the number of names are limited between all the players, so you'll often hear this nickname throughout the games across many players. And then we start to change the position based off what we have in the player card. And then I always take a look at the college to and from to see if it makes sense. So in this case, I don't want it to be from Tunisia, and so I'll just randomize this as well. And then qualifies for world team, depending on the player that you're creating, is very important. So oftentimes a lot of folks, when they're creating players, they expect to see certain players on the world team, but they don't. And then there are players that shouldn't be on the world team, but they are. And the reason for this is this toggle. So especially if you're importing a player DNA, this toggle does not change on its own based off the player DNA. You have to manually turn it on and off. So that's one thing to note. Another thing that I do is, since we're changing the age, change this to 23. And then the years pro, we're going to bring this down to 3. So Isaiah Thomas was 4 years pro. We'll change this now down to 3. And then another thing I want to note as you're using the 2K base is that the peak start and the peak end usually is 3 years for the 2K bases. For the player DNAs, it's going to apply the peak and the end accordingly. But if you're using a 2K base, you want to remember to change this, because this is going to have an impact on how the players play. Now, you'll notice that, yet again, as a reminder, I do not have the boom and bust, and that's because this is current gen on the Xbox. As a reminder, just in case you're wondering why this looks different. And so another thing before we move on that I want to note is going to be associated with the player number or the jersey number. And so what I notice is that when you're creating players and you assign them to a roster, the player is going to keep the number that was given to them as part of the creative process. The number, and this is a problem in a sense, because I noticed when it came to Axel Walden, when I added him to the Pelicans for my league, Brandon Ingram has the same number as him, which is 14. So 2K doesn't overwrite the number that you give your player. It keeps the player as is for that first season. And that's mainly because the player itself does not have a contract with the team. So technically, he doesn't exist on the team officially. So once the player gets a contract, then the number will change, which is exactly what happened with Axel. He ended up getting the number 17 while Brandon Ingram had 14. And so you'll see that oftentimes when you're creating your players and assigning them to my league. And so for this, I'm not going to bother changing the numbers. I did some research and I noticed that there are a lot of players already that have jersey numbers that were technically retired for their specific teams. But I know that being that this year is technically not an official year from a contractual perspective, once they do sign on officially with the team after the season, their number is going to change based off of that contract. Another fun fact is that if you look at the kicks, their colorways change from when you assign them on the team to when they actually have a contract with the team, which I thought was very interesting as well. So now that we changed the vitals, I'm going to skip the appearance for the time being. I usually save that for last because that takes the most time. But then I usually go to the body, so we're going to change this to the 6'11 and the 255. I don't typically touch the wingspan and the shoulder width, but I may do that in the future, depending on how funky it looks, because I did notice that some wingspans look crazy. But from here, once we have the body, I tend to look at the accessories, if there are any, to see if it looks out of whack, because sometimes they're a bit OD. But the main focus for the build is really around the attributes. And so from here, you'll see that we have a number of attributes being selected, and this follows the same approach as Unique Musique. These attributes are done randomly. 5 attributes are selected out of all of the attributes, and they're changed based off of a randomized number. The only difference between Unique Musique's approach and mine is that I also included the potential as part of this creation process. And the main reason I did this is because a lot of all-time players were being selected. And so usually if they're lower on the roster, they have a low overall, and that overall tends to dictate what their potential will be. So I always thought that, hey, if we're changing a player's attributes, right? What if we change the potential? So for example, if I think one of the people that I selected for another player was Rick Roberson. He had 69 overall with the potential of 75. But based on the randomizer that I used for that player, the player's potential was upgraded to 99. So assuming that the player is now younger, tendencies have changed and is getting more PT, it may be that this player eventually has a career that's better than Rick Roberson's. So this is why I included the potential here. And so as I go about making changes to the attributes based off of the player card, I'd like to note it down to see what's being changed and the overall number of changes across the spectrum, so I can see what are the pluses and minuses for this new player that's being created compared to the player DNA. So if you remember, Isaiah Thomas has a 96 overall, two-way slashing playmaker, and is a point guard, shooting guard in 2K. The very first thing, you'll see that the randomizer decreased the driving layup down to 88. So we'll do that. And then I'm just going to make all of the changes that I just highlighted associated with this player card, and then we'll dive back into this. All right. So I don't know if you noticed this, but I just changed the intangibles down to 25. And I've done this for all of the players in this league, mainly because I noticed that this inflates a player's overall. And I think a lot of YouTube creators have identified this as well as part of their experimentations and simulations. But a good example of this is in Click's My GM / My Career series for the Portland Trailblazers, where he talks about how Thaddeus Young, who I believe was an 86, compared to Kai Jones, who's a creative player who had an overall of 75, how the 75 player was essentially playing a lot better than the 86 overall player. And a lot of this is tied to the intangibles, because it boosts up the overall rating. So as a result, to get to the raw player ability, for me, I reduced the intangibles down to 25 because that's the lowest you could go in the creation process. And so you'll notice that before, I don't know if you paused this as you're watching this because I tried to speed through it, but offensively, all of the attributes were reduced by a substantial amount with the exception of the driving layup. However, defensively, his attributes improved. So he might be defensively as good as Gary Payton, assuming his position was still a point guard, shooting guard. But offensively, I don't want to say that everything got downgraded, because from a shooting perspective, he's still going to be a beast. But when it comes to his shooting IQ as well as his hands, that went kaput. And so once we have that, what I then go about doing is I look at the attributes compared to the player card, the second player card, and then identify what badges are going to be applied, mainly because I'm already in this screen. But instead of doing that now, what I'm going to do is move over to the tendencies so you can understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it there. And then we'll come back to the badges. So now let's talk about tendencies. Unique Mazik did not touch this as part of his creation process because he thought it was OD, and I can't hold you. It is a bit insane to actually go this far into the weeds. But as I mentioned before, there's a reason for this madness, mainly because of my experience with the draft class players. Now, with the exception of Harry Reynolds and Vitaly Belus, maybe even Bob Montgomery, a lot of players that had imported DNAs did not perform as well as I had hoped, compared to those that did not have imported player DNAs that performed decent or even well. For example, Frank Mack. He was supposed to come off the bench, but they ended up putting him in the starting lineup against my team for Miles. And he was able to take some incredible shots and make some incredible plays despite having a low overall and not having a player DNA imported into him, which led me to investigate this even further. So for example, KOT4Q, as he's doing a lot of simulations, some of which are rebuilds, mainly rebuilds, but then there are also hypothetical simulations of what could happen if you do a certain thing. So for example, recently he's been experimenting with taking a lot of random generated players in draft classes and trying to have them achieve some really cool accolades, like being the youngest MVP or being the 60th draft pick overall. That makes it to the Hall of Fame. So he's constantly referring to the tendencies, especially around shooting, because if the shot tendency is low, then the player will not make any attempts to shoot, even if the attribute itself is high. So as a result, this will not only impact the player's overall abilities on the court, which is a common issue with a lot of the low attribute players in 2K, but it also have an impact on those that have high attributes that you would expect to perform well. What reinforces this is Click Productions, or I'm Click, within those two channels. And Click is also known for his rebuilds and simulations, as well as my team. And so, as I mentioned before, he had a My Career, My GM series where he tried to rebuild the Trailblazers and played as Dame to get Dame a ring. Now, as part of that series, he highlighted across, I believe, 3 episodes how Thaddeus Young, who had an overall of 86, but he was performing worse than Kai Jones, who had an overall of 75, which was tied to the tendencies. So as a result, I went down this rabbit hole and I created a randomizer around the tendencies to then change them for this player. And so let's do that now, based off of what we have for the player card. All right. So what you saw is that we made slight modifications to whether or not this player will shoot underneath the basket. It actually went down a bit. and as well as the mid-range shot went down a little bit. However, you did see the shot from mid-right increase a lot, as well as the shot from the three, but left center. Now, I don't know if this is actually based off of percentages or whatnot, but I would expect that as things increase, you'll see that the shots will increase as well. And you also see that the standing dunk was 0, and this now got jumped up all the way to 8. So if this player's in the paint, one would assume that this player will actually take a standing dunk in the paint compared to before, where Isaiah Thomas would not have. So let's talk about the signatures now that we have the tendencies done. I actually took the same approach as Unique Musique in that I randomized the lower bass and the upper bass, but I also did the same thing for the release timing, and I can't recall if Unique Musique did that as well, so I'll have to check on that. But if you actually did look at the video, leave a comment and let me know whether or not Unique Musique actually changed the release timing as well. But then I also changed the free throw associated with the player, since the free throw is assigned to the player DNA. So also let me know if Unique Musique did that, because I can't remember at this point in time. And so in this case, being that this player is 6'11", he's not going to have access to all the jump shots as those players that are 6'9" and under. So for example, scrolling to the right, you see we have jump shot 18, and then it jumps to 24. And that's mainly tied to the height. So in this case, we're going to go all the way to set shot 38. And then change the release accordingly. So for the release, there is no threshold as far as height. Like everybody could get any release that's assigned to it. It's really just the lower base that changes when it comes to the jump shot. And then for the release timing, we're going to change this to very slow. Doesn't look too bad, but he looks kind of stiff. And then for the free throw, we're going to change this to Steph Curry. All right. So now with the signatures done, let's move on to the badges. Now, another thing that I did differently when it comes to the badges is that I actually played around with the personality badges, whereas Unique Musique did not. And I did this because this is actually tied to how the players interact with their teammates, as well as interact with the coaching staff, etc. And it plays a factor when it comes to trade, signing, as well as team chemistry in the off season. And so I wanted to add this because this adds additional variability between the player compared to the DNA that was brought in, or the base that 2K assigns the player. Because oftentimes the personality badges do not exist for the 2K bases, whereas this approach actually gives each of these players their own personality, so that they maneuver their own way within the league. And so in this case, you see we do have some personality badges assigned already. And so what the randomizer identifies, so for example, if we do have expressive, we would apply expressive. But what I learned is that some of these badges offset the other, which is why there are two sections for the cards. The top section is going to be the badges that we're applying, and then the offset is just to highlight what are the badges that offset those listed above. So in this case, for badge number 4, you see that Pat My Back is going to be an offset for that, which is actually badge number 5. This is why I crossed out Keep It Real, because once I toggle on Pat My Back, Keep It Real is going to turn off. So just to walk you through this, as I do this, I'm just going to go back to the top. I'm going to equip Enforcer. So for example, if Alpha Dog is equipped because the randomizer didn't say touch it, I actually left that because that adds yet another layer, right? So we're going to equip Enforcer. I'm going to come down to Extremely Confident, High Work Ethic. And just as an example, if I were to toggle on Legendary Work Ethic, it's going to turn off High Work Ethic as a result. So I'm going to toggle that back on, and then I'm going to scroll down to Keep It Real as an example, toggle this back on, and then toggle on Pat My Back. It turns off Keep It Real. And so now with the Skill badges, what we're going to do is we're just going to assign the badges that we discussed previously based off of the player card that was identified during the attribute portion of this video. Now, being that this is 32 badges, I'm going to take a brief pause, make the changes, and I'll get back to you. Pause for a second. While I was editing this video, I realized there was a major portion of the badge section that I didn't even talk about, and this is related to how the badges were identified and applied. So I used the same approach that Unique Musique had, and that established the randomizer to identify whether a person gets from 1 badge up to 60 badges. But it doesn't stop there. What Unique Musique then did is that he established levels for all of the badges. So if you had a 70 or under rating, you potentially qualified for bronze. If you had between 75 and 79, you had silver. Gold would be 80 to 84, and then HOF would be 85 and above. I did not take that approach because while I was doing some research, I came across 2K Labs and their badge rankings, as well as what are the threshold and attributes you would need to actually qualify for a gold and HOF badge. Now, being that they only had 2 levels, what I did, and this is real geeky of me, I pretty much created a stratification so that I could have between bronze and HOF, and then using formulas, I created averages for each of these badges associated with the players. Now, what you see on the screen is exactly what's shown on 2K Labs, but the badges that are being shown right now are only associated with next gen. So I had to do some rejiggering for the current gen to make it work for me. And what you'll also see in this 2K Labs video is that the threshold for the badges are different based on the position. And so I applied that logic as well in my randomization, which is also different from Unique Musique's. Now, let's get back to the player creation vid. All right, so to recap, this player is going to have 32 skill badges. However, what we had to do is also overwrite some of the badges that Isaiah Thomas had, so that removed a lot of the finishing badges to leave this player with only 2. Similarly, we're going to have 7 shooting badges and a slew of playmaking badges and defensive badges, but overall we get up to 32 badges in total, with no rebounding badges whatsoever, because this player will not be able to do that, or at least I shouldn't say that. This player will be able to rebound. He just won't have any badges associated with it, considering the attributes are so low. I think offensively, his rebound is going to be 30, and then defensively, it's a 55. So now that we have the badges in place, now we get to the face creation. I gotta admit, man, I got much appreciation for what the infamous NY does with his creation vids, because it is difficult to create faces, let alone trying to build virtual faces based off of real life people. And so what I do as part of my approach to remove bias from my approach is I have the randomizer select the preset that I'm going to use, which I believe may be different from Unique Musique's approach. So let me know in the comments if you saw something different. But based on the preset, I then look for an athlete or a sports entertainer or just somebody famous that fits the preset, and I try to get a close resemblance to the preset. And then from there, I update the skin tone to match what was selected by the randomizer. Now, if we refer back to our player card, we're going to use the preset under column 1, row 9. So it's going to be column 1, scroll down to row 9, and we're going to edit this head. And so what's difficult about this approach is that I believe, I don't know this for certain, but I think that the infamous NY finds the right head that matches the person that he's recreating in 2K. Whereas in this approach, I'm getting a random head. And so oftentimes things aren't gonna look as close to the person as I would like, but it gets the job done, essentially. And so who we're going to build today is going to be based off of Mark Anthony K, who's a footballer, or for us folks in the US, a soccer player from the Colorado Rapids in MLS. And he's originally based from Canada, so I'll be considering whether or not I change the vitals that we had earlier in the video to make it so that he's from Canada, just to add a little flair to the player. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to work on the head and try to get it as close to Mark Anthony K as possible, which means I may change the skin tone to match Mark Anthony K's just to see what you guys think about my abilities. And then from there, we're going to finalize the player by getting to the proper skin tone that he should be, and also make any slight modifications, because as you know, with the noses and the mouths based on the preset head that you select, some skin tones really don't rock with it that much, and so you might need to make some final changes accordingly. So we'll do that. I'll take the first stab at getting this player as close to Mark Anthony K, not Michael Anthony K, as possible, and then we'll finalize this together. So, all right. So this is the best that I think I'm gonna get it, mainly because a lot of these presets, oftentimes when you start doing things over and over again, they start to look very similar, at least maybe to me. Probably should reach out to the infamous NY to see how he goes about doing this, but this player right now reminds me of Andre Redding, probably because of the nose and the lips, but in any event, we'll move on. So now that we got the face, what we need to do is create some additional changes to the skin tone as well as the hair, because what we have right now definitely is going to be the final one. So in order to get the face as close as possible, I changed the preset color from, I believe, skin 2 to skin 5 just to see what it would look like. So now we're going to change this to skin 9. And as I was saying before, when you look at the face, like the skin tone compared to the lips and to the nose, this looks foobar, man. And so I'm just gonna add some freckles, some pock marks. I'm not gonna add any blemishes, because even when you toggle this on, outside of blemish number 1, the other blemishes are just slight discolorations. Actually, let's do blemish 2. And so now that we have the skin tone applied, we got to make some changes to the lips and to the nose, because it just doesn't look right. So I'm going to toggle this, see what we can deal with. Off the rip, I'm comfortable with this. Might just change the width of the mouth, change the thickness a little bit. And I'm fine with this. But then with the nose, we could probably keep the nose, right? Oh, if we lower this even further, would it look right? I don't know. To me, it still looks weird. It still looks weird, but you know what? I'm gonna go against the grain. I'm just gonna leave the nose as is, unless another nose makes sense. I've used this nose so many times that I don't want to use it. Let's see if we lower the width on this, how it looks. Yeah, I think I can rock with this. I think I can rock with this. All right. Now for the hair. Part of me is thinking we leave the hair as is. I don't know. Let me know what y'all think. Because the other hairs, you see these types of hairs so many times. I'm thinking we just leave it as a flat top fade. Yeah. I think so. And then for the facial hair, might add similar facial hair to what Mark Anthony K has, which I think is going to be like a stash and a goatee. Yeah. Not that one. Might have too much facial hair in this one. Yeah, I think this will do. All right. So now for the name. So I thought about this for a while. And what I typically did in the past is I try to find a name that the announcers and the PA is going to actually say while playing the game. but I'm still debating as to whether or not I'm going to have that type of audio in the gameplay. And also, it gets very hard finding names that match the player that the announcer is actually going to say. The majority of the time, they say the nickname as opposed to the last name. So in this case, whatever the last name will be. Well, let me just say it. Think about naming this guy Logan Wolf. So just put that in now. Oops. There we go. And then for the first name, we gotta put Logan. But oftentimes, sometimes the names just don't rock well. So I'm still trying to figure that out since I have, I want to say like 120 players to go. But for now, this will be Logan Wolf. And that does it. That is how we go about creating a player for this Fictional Basketball League. So if you like this video and you want to see more content like this, please leave a like. Leave some comments down below as far as whether or not you want to see some of the other players that were created. I do intend on having some team spotlights where we walk through the teams as well as some of the top 3 to 5 players on those teams to show you what they're about. Also want to get into some gameplay of the team so you can see how these players perform on the field. But this has been fun. I know this is probably a long vid based on how long it took me to record the vid. But like I said, leave a comment below. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you next time.